James Sullivan had been the night janitor at Riverside Technologies for 6 years. At 42, he approached his work with the same careful attention he brought to everything else in his life. Methodically, thoroughly, and with a quiet pride that came from doing honest work well. What made James different from many of his colleagues was that he never worked alone. Every evening at 7 o'clock, 9-year-old Emma Sullivan would arrive at the office building with her father, settling into a corner of the lobby with her homework, a worn backpack, and the kind of mature patience that children develop when circumstances require it of them. Emma had been James's constant companion since her mother died 3 years ago. The after-school programs were too expensive, babysitters were beyond their budget, and family was scattered across the country. So Emma learned to do her multiplication tables in corporate break rooms, to read chapter books in office lobbies, and to find adventure in the quiet corridors of a building that most people only saw during business hours. James had tried to make their situation work. Their small apartment was clean and safe. Emma never missed school, and she was well-fed and well-loved. But the walls were thin, the neighbors were sometimes loud, and James often worried that his bright, curious daughter deserved more space, more quiet, more of the stability that seemed always just out of reach. The crisis came on a Tuesday evening in November. James and Emma arrived at Riverside Technologies to discover that their apartment building had been evacuated due to a gas leak. The fire department estimated repairs would take at least a week, possibly longer. The Red Cross had set up a temporary shelter at the community center, but James had visited it once and seen the overcrowded conditions, the lack of privacy, the difficulty of maintaining any kind of normal routine for a child who was already dealing with so much uncertainty. "Daddy," Emma said as they sat in the Riverside lobby, her homework spread across a low table while James tried to figure out what to do. "What if we stayed here tonight, just until we can go home?" James felt his heart clench at his daughter's matter-of-fact acceptance of their situation. "Sweetheart, we can't sleep in the office building. That's not allowed." Emma considered this seriously, the way she considered all problems that required creative solutions. "Well," she said finally, "what about outside? There's that really nice doghouse behind the building, by the little garden area. It looked pretty big when we walked past it yesterday." James stared at his daughter, trying to process what she'd just suggested. "Emma, honey, you can't sleep in a doghouse." "Why not?" Emma asked with genuine curiosity. "It has a roof and walls, and it's probably warmer than some places." "Remember that story you read me about the little girl who lived in a railway car and made it into a home?" The doghouse Emma was referring to belonged to Winston, the golden retriever who came to work every day with Victoria Riverside, the company's founder and CEO. Victoria was a woman in her early 60s who had built Riverside Technologies from a small software startup into one of the region's most successful companies. Winston was her constant companion, a therapy dog who had free run of the office and his own elaborate doghouse in the small courtyard garden. James had seen the doghouse during his evening rounds. It was indeed large, well-insulated, and probably more weatherproof than he wanted to admit. But the thought of his daughter seriously considering it as a housing option made him feel like he was failing at the most important job he'd ever had. "Emma," he said gently, "we'll figure something else out. Maybe there's a motel room we can afford, or—" But Emma had already moved on to practical planning. "We could bring some blankets from the supply closet, the soft ones they keep for the employee lounge. And there's that little heater by the security desk that Mr. Martinez never uses." James felt tears threaten at his daughter's resilience, her ability to find solutions where he saw only problems. But he also felt the weight of reality. They had nowhere else to go, no family to call, no savings account robust enough for an extended hotel stay. What they didn't know was that Victoria Riverside was working late that night, catching up on quarterly reports in her corner office that overlooked the courtyard. At 63, Victoria had learned to pay attention to the rhythms of her building, to notice when things were different or when people needed help they weren't comfortable asking for. She'd noticed James and Emma in the lobby, seen the way they were lingering past their usual routine, observed Emma's backpack that looked packed for more than just homework. As a businesswoman who had spent 40 years reading people and situations, Victoria recognized the signs of a family dealing with an emergency. When she heard Emma's voice drifting up from the courtyard, talking about the doghouse with the kind of determined optimism that broke Victoria's heart, she knew she had to act. Victoria made her way downstairs, Winston trotting beside her as they approached the father and daughter who were now standing outside, examining the doghouse with the serious consideration of people evaluating a potential shelter. "James," Victoria called gently, not wanting to startle them. "Is everything all right?" James turned, his face immediately flushing with embarrassment at being caught in their desperate moment. "Ms. Riverside, I'm so sorry. There was an issue with our apartment building, and Emma was just curious about Winston's house," Emma finished matter-of-factly, not yet old enough to be embarrassed by their circumstances. "It's very well built. Good insulation, proper ventilation. Better than some people houses, I bet." Victoria studied Emma's face, seeing the intelligence in her eyes, the way she was trying to solve an adult problem with a child's creative thinking. She looked at James, noting the pride and worry warring in his expression, the way he was trying to protect his daughter's dignity while dealing with an impossible situation. "You know," Victoria said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking that Winston's house is really too big for just one dog. He barely uses half the space." She paused, meeting Emma's eyes with complete seriousness. "But I have a better idea. How would you feel about being house sitters?" James looked confused. "House sitters?" "I have a small guest house on my property," Victoria explained. "It's been empty for months, and I've been worrying about security, about keeping it maintained and lived in. I was just thinking today that I should find someone reliable to stay there, someone who would take good care of it." Emma's eyes widened with hope, but James's expression grew more guarded. "Miss Riverside, that's very kind, but we couldn't accept charity." "It wouldn't be charity," Victoria said firmly. "It would be employment. House sitting is a real job, James. Someone needs to check the pipes, maintain the garden, make sure everything stays in good condition. And Emma here strikes me as someone who would take excellent care of a house." She turned to Emma with the kind of respect she usually reserved for business partners. "The question is, are you responsible enough to help your father with such an important job?" Emma straightened with pride. "Yes, ma'am. I'm very responsible. I always do my homework, I keep our apartment clean, and I know how to water plants and check that doors are locked." Victoria nodded solemnly. "Those are exactly the qualifications I'm looking for." She looked back at James. "The position comes with a fair salary, and of course, housing is provided. Think of it as a temporary arrangement while you figure out your long-term housing situation." James felt overwhelmed by the generosity of the offer, and also by the dignity with which Victoria was presenting it. She wasn't offering charity. She was offering opportunity, employment, a chance to contribute rather than simply receive. "I don't know what to say," he said quietly. "Say yes, Daddy," Emma whispered, tugging on his sleeve. "Please?" Victoria smiled at Emma's enthusiasm, then addressed James with the directness that had made her successful in business. "James, I've been watching you work for 6 years. You're reliable, honest, and you've raised a remarkable daughter under circumstances that would challenge anyone. I need someone I can trust with my property, and I can't think of anyone I'd trust more." She paused, her voice softening. "And Emma, every house needs children's laughter to make it a real home. Mine has been too quiet for too long." That night, James and Emma found themselves in a small but comfortable guest house, complete with a full kitchen, a cozy living room, and 2 bedrooms with windows that looked out over Victoria's garden. Emma fell asleep in her own bed for the first time in months, her homework spread across a real desk, her clothes hanging in a closet that was hers to use. James sat in the living room, looking around at the space that felt almost too good to be true, and wondered how his daughter's innocent question about a doghouse had led to this unexpected blessing. The next morning, Victoria stopped by to check on them, bringing fresh muffins and coffee. "How did you sleep?" she asked Emma, who was eating breakfast at the kitchen table. "It was perfect," Emma said with the kind of contentment that made Victoria's heart warm. "And you know what?" I think Winston's doghouse is still the nicest doghouse I've ever seen. But this house is definitely better for people. Victoria laughed, a sound full of genuine joy. I'm glad you approve. And Emma, I have a proposition for you. Emma looked up with interest. I need someone to help me train Winston for his therapy work. He needs practice with children, and you seem to have a natural way with animals. Would you be interested in being his assistant trainer? After your homework is done, of course. Emma's face lit up with excitement. Really? I could help train Winston? If your father approves, Victoria said, looking at James with a question in her eyes. James nodded, seeing the happiness in his daughter's face, understanding that Victoria was offering not just housing, but community, purpose, a sense of belonging that neither of them had expected to find. Over the following weeks, Emma threw herself into her new responsibilities with the seriousness she brought to everything important. She helped maintain the garden, assisted with Winston's training, and treated the guest house with the kind of careful respect that showed she understood it was a gift, not a right. James continued his work at Riverside Technologies, but now he worked with the security that comes from knowing your child is safe, happy, and thriving. Victoria often joined them for dinner, enjoying Emma's endless questions about business, science, and life in general. One evening, as they sat in the garden watching Emma play with Winston, Victoria turned to James with a thoughtful expression. I want you to know, she said quietly, that Emma's willingness to sleep in a doghouse wasn't what convinced me to help you. It was the fact that you've raised a daughter who sees solutions where others see problems, who faces difficulties with courage and creativity. She paused, watching Emma teach Winston a new trick with infinite patience. That kind of resilience, that kind of character, those are the qualities that built my company. They're the qualities that build good lives. James felt tears threaten as he understood the depth of what Victoria was telling him. She's the best thing I've ever done, he said simply. And she's going to do great things, Victoria replied. I can see it already. 6 months later, when the emergency that had started their journey was long resolved, Victoria made James and Emma a permanent offer. The guest house could be theirs for as long as they needed it, in exchange for James taking on additional responsibilities as head of facilities management. A promotion that came with benefits, a substantial raise, and the kind of job security that allowed for long-term planning. Emma continued to thrive, excelling in school, working with Winston, and bringing the kind of joy to Victoria's property that reminded everyone why children's laughter is one of life's most precious sounds. And sometimes, when Emma was playing in the garden, she would pat Winston's elaborate doghouse with affection and whisper, "Thank you for being too small for people. Because if you hadn't been, we never would have found our real home." Victoria, overhearing this one day, smiled and made a mental note to have the doghouse expanded. Not because Winston needed more space, but because it had become a symbol of how the most desperate moments can sometimes lead to the most unexpected blessings, and how the simple act of seeing people's potential rather than their problems can change lives in ways that ripple far beyond what anyone imagines.